the 17th of November 1944, a dimly lit bunker beneath Berlin's Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production. The cold concrete walls muffled the distant rumble of Allied bombs falling on the city above, while two of Germany's most brilliant weapons designers confronted a truth that would shatter every assumption the Wehrmacht held about the future of infantry warfare. Colonel Wilhelm Krause, head of the Heereswaffenamt's Small Arms Development Division, sat across from his longtime colleague Dr. Heinrich Vollmer, the chief designer at Mauser, whose genius had brought the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44 from concept to battlefield reality. Both men had reached their positions through demonstrated technical brilliance and meticulous attention to detail. Both had spent years developing advanced infantry weapons with professional precision, and both were now staring at documents that represented something far more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Between them lay a stack of papers that appeared unremarkable, standard production reports and field assessments from the Eastern Front. The forms were bureaucratic, mundane even, filled with columns of numbers recording weapons delivered, ammunition consumed, and casualties sustained. Nothing about their appearance suggested they contained information that would prove the mathematical impossibility of the Sturmgewehr 44 changing the tide of war, despite being the most revolutionary infantry weapon of the century. Yet the numbers they contained represented a tactical reality so overwhelming that both officers had spent the previous week cross-referencing sources, checking calculations, and searching desperately for errors that would make the figures less apocalyptic. Vollmer's hands trembled slightly as he pushed the top document across the time desk. It was a simple deployment report from Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, listing monthly deliveries of the new Sturmgewehr 44 to frontline units fighting the Soviet advance. The form was stamped, dated, signed by multiple logistics officers, clearly authentic. Krause studied the figures in silence, his face growing pale as he absorbed their implications. The Wehrmacht had delivered just 4,750 Sturmgewehrs to the entire Eastern Front during October 1944, while Soviet forces received over 150,000 new PPS-41 submachine guns during the same period. He looked up at Vollmer, searching his colleague's face for some indication this was error or deception. Vollmer's expression offered no comfort. He had already worked through the same calculations, reached the same conclusions, and spent 3 sleepless nights hoping he was wrong. "This cannot be accurate," Krause said quietly, though his tone carried no conviction. He was not stating a belief, but expressing a wish, the desperate hope that reality might somehow be less terrible than the evidence suggested. Vollmer pulled another document from the stack. "I thought the same. This is a battlefield assessment from General Heinrich's 1st Panzer Army. They received 650 Sturmgewehrs last month for 3 infantry divisions." He paused, letting the numbers settle. "I compared this to their casualty reports. They're losing almost 900 men per day. Even if every soldier carried our new weapon, which they don't, they'd run out of men to wield them within weeks." The two men had spent the past week engaged in exactly this kind of comparison, cross-referencing production reports with battlefield deployments, casualty statistics with training timelines, material availability with manufacturing capacity. Every source confirmed the same impossible truth. The Sturmgewehr 44 was not just arriving too late, it was arriving in quantities so limited that it could never overcome the fundamental arithmetic of the Eastern Front, where Wehrmacht divisions faced Soviet armies 10 times their size. This advantage was not marginal but overwhelming, sufficient to make any tactical advantage from superior small arms irrelevant when facing such numerical superiority. The journey to this moment of terrible clarity had begun years earlier, but its roots stretched back into fundamental miscalculations about Soviet industrial potential and German weapons development priorities. The German military had tracked Soviet weapons manufacturing since before the war, compiling reports on factory locations, production capabilities, and resource availability. But they had consistently catastrophically underestimated what the Soviets could achieve when fully mobilized. particularly after relocating entire industrial complexes beyond the Ural Mountains. This was not mere incompetence. The assumptions built into German strategic thinking, shaped by Nazi racial ideology and Germany's own industrial experience, made Soviet industrial power seem impossible, even fantastical. Germany's own wartime experience colored everything they believed about weapons production. By 1944, the Reich had mobilized every available resource, stripped occupied territories of raw materials and machinery, implemented slave labor on a massive scale, and pushed its industrial capacity to what seemed like absolute limits. German factories operated around the clock. Workers put in extended shifts. Production of weapons and ammunition had increased dramatically from pre-war levels. Germany was producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates that would have seemed unthinkable in 1939. Yet, despite this total mobilization, despite conquering most of Europe and exploiting its resources, despite the desperate intensification of production under Albert Speer's direction, Germany was losing the material war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The fundamental German miscalculation began before the first shot was fired. In 1940, as German forces prepared for Operation Barbarossa, intelligence assessments suggested the Soviets had approximately 10,000 tanks. The actual number exceeded 24,000. German estimates counted 8,000 Soviet aircraft. The Red Air Force had over 19,000. But perhaps most crucially, German planners dramatically underestimated Soviet small arms production capacity. When presented to Hitler and his generals, Soviet pre-war production figures were dismissed as unreliable or deliberate misinformation. The assessment seemed entirely reasonable based on available intelligence. The Soviet Union had performed poorly during the Winter War against Finland. Their officers had been decimated by Stalin's purges. Their equipment was considered obsolete and poorly maintained. How could a nation with such apparent military weaknesses suddenly produce weapons in quantities that dwarfed German output? It violated every principle of industrial mobilization that German experience had established. Building factories took years. Training workers required months. Developing production techniques demanded extensive trial and error. Soviet production claims seemed like fantasy rather than achievable reality. Field Marshal Wilhelm Krause, chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, reportedly dismissed reports of Soviet manufacturing capability, stating that Slavic peoples could only produce crude, simplistic weapons, not the sophisticated arms needed for modern warfare. Whether the exact quote is accurate, the sentiment it captured was certainly real. German leadership genuinely believed Soviet industrial capacity was unsuited for advanced weapons production. This assessment seemed supported by observable facts. Soviet equipment captured in the early months of Barbarossa was often rough in finish, lacking the precision engineering of German equipment. The Germans failed to understand something fundamental about Soviet industrial potential that would prove decisive. The Soviet approach to weapons manufacturing emphasized simplicity, standardization, and mass production over technical sophistication or quality finishing. Where German weapons were often masterpieces of engineering, Soviet designs prioritized ease of manufacture, reliability under harsh conditions, and sheer quantity. The PPS-41 submachine gun exemplified this philosophy. Designed by Georgy Shpagin in 1941 specifically for mass production, it could be manufactured largely by workers with minimal training, using stamped sheet metal rather than precision-milled components. A Soviet factory could produce a PPS 41 inches just 3 labor hours compared to the 70-plus hours required for the German MP-40. The German military intelligence services, particularly Foreign Armies East under Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, had the institutional responsibility for tracking Soviet capabilities. Throughout 1941 and 1942, as the Soviet Union evacuated entire factories beyond the Ural Mountains and rebuilt its industrial base, the intelligence picture reaching Berlin remained incomplete and confusing. Reports of Soviet production capacity varied wildly depending on source and method. Some indicated massive increases in output, factories running multiple shifts, tens of thousands of submachine guns rolling off assembly lines. Other reports suggested continued economic struggles, untrained workers, inefficient production methods, equipment of inferior quality. The German High Command chose to believe the more comforting assessments, the ones that aligned with their preconceptions about Soviet weakness. This selective acceptance of intelligence was not unique to the Germans. All military organizations tend to favor information confirming existing beliefs over data, challenging core assumptions. But in Germany's case, the cost of this cognitive bias proved catastrophic, particularly in the development and deployment of the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44. The concept for this weapon had emerged as early as 1935, when military theorists recognized the changing nature of infantry combat. Traditional bolt-action rifles like the Mauser 98K were designed for accurate fire at ranges up to 800 meters, but actual combat data showed most infantry engagements occurred under 300 meters. At these distances, fully automatic weapons like submachine guns proved devastatingly effective, but their pistol ammunition lacked range and stopping power. What was needed was a hybrid, a weapon firing an intermediate cartridge, powerful enough for medium-range effectiveness, but controllable in full automatic fire. This concept, the storm rifle or assault rifle, represented the future of infantry combat. German engineers understood this earlier than anyone else. By 1938, the Heereswaffenamt had issued requirements for such a weapon. By 1940, the first prototypes were being tested. By 1941, as German forces invaded the Soviet Union, the weapon that would eventually become the Sturmgewehr 44 existed in working form, yet it would take until 1944, 3 years later, before significant numbers reached frontline units. The delay proved catastrophic. While Hitler initially rejected the concept, dismissing it as a waste of resources and insisting that standard rifles remained sufficient, the real problems came after he finally approved mass production in 1943. By then, Allied bombing was systematically targeting German industry. Raw materials, particularly high-grade steel, were becoming critically scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted into the Wehrmacht to replace mounting casualties. The production figures told the tragic story. Between 1943 and 1945, Germany manufactured approximately 425,000 Sturmgewehrs. During the same period, the Soviet Union produced over 6 million PPS-41 submachine guns, a weapon that, while technically inferior to the Sturmgewehr, provided the critical capability of high-volume automatic fire that dominated the close-quarters combat of the Eastern Front. Colonel Krause had received the first comprehensive production assessment in late October 1944. The numbers shocked him to his core. Despite Albert Speer's desperate prioritization of Sturmgewehr production, despite pulling resources from other weapons programs, despite 3-shift operations at manufacturing plants, total monthly output had reached only 30,000 units by autumn 1944. This figure represented a significant achievement given the circumstances. Factory managers had performed near miracles of improvisation. Engineers had redesigned components to use less strategic materials. Workers put in 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. The manufacturing processes had been streamlined repeatedly, reducing labor hours per weapon from 110 to just over 50. Yet these heroic efforts paled beside the fundamental arithmetic of the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht was losing approximately 5,000 men per day to combat casualties, disease, and exposure. Even if every single Sturmgewehr manufactured went to the Eastern Front, which they didn't, as significant numbers were diverted to the Western Front, Italy, and Waffen-SS units. They could not replace losses, much less re-equip entire divisions. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was drafting and training 650,000 new soldiers every month by late 1944. These recruits received basic weapons training on the PPS-41, then were sent to the front in waves that seemed endless to exhausted German defenders. Where German units measured their ammunition supply in days or even hours of combat, Soviet forces appeared to have unlimited reserves. Dr. Vollmer approached these facts with the methodical precision that had made him one of Germany's most respected weapons designers. He was an engineer from a family that embodied German technical excellence, but he was also a practical manufacturer, trained to evaluate production data objectively, regardless of personal preferences. The Sturmgewehr 44 was his masterpiece, the culmination of decades of small arms development, a weapon so advanced that it would define infantry combat for the next century. American, Soviet, and British forces that captured examples immediately recognized its revolutionary significance. It was, quite simply, the most important infantry weapon invention of the war. But Vollmer was also a realist. The deployment reports represented hard data that could be quantified, compared, and analyzed. He began calculating systematically. If the Wehrmacht needed at minimum 25 Sturmgewehrs per company to make a tactical difference, and there were over 300 infantry battalions on the Eastern Front, just the initial deployment would require 75,000 weapons, 2.5 months of total production at current rates. To fully convert, the Eastern Front forces would require over 500,000 Sturmgewehrs, more than the total production run of the weapon throughout the entire war. And this calculation didn't account for ongoing losses, training requirements, or the need for massive ammunition production for the new 7.92 x 33mm cartridge. The arithmetic was merciless and undeniable. The weapon itself might be revolutionary, but it had arrived too late and in quantities too limited to change the strategic situation. Individual units equipped with the Sturmgewehr reported significant tactical advantages, particularly in urban combat or defensive positions where its controllable automatic fire could devastate Soviet infantry assaults. Battle reports from the Courland Pocket, where the 31st Infantry Division had received substantial numbers of the new weapon, described devastating defensive actions where single German squads equipped with Sturmgewehrs held off Soviet companies. In the ruins of Budapest, specially equipped storm battalions used the weapon's advantages to inflict casualties at a ratio of 7-1. These tactical successes, while impressive, could not change the strategic equation. For every Soviet soldier killed, 3 more arrived as replacements. For every Sturmgewehr deployed to the front, the Soviets sent 20 pp 41 seconds. The war had become a brutal exercise in arithmetic, and the numbers favored the Soviets by margins too great for any technical superiority to overcome. Krause pushed another document across the table, this one detailing the logistics of ammunition supply. Even if we had enough weapons, we don't have the industrial capacity to produce enough 7.92 x 33mm cartridges. Standard units are still using 7.92 x 57mm for their Mausers and MG-42s. We've created a logistics nightmare, 2 different ammunition types that can't be interchanged. This logistical reality further limited the Sturmgewehr's impact. Units receiving the new weapon also needed entirely new ammunition supply chains. In a military already stretched beyond breaking point, managing 2 different ammunition types for the same tactical units created confusion, waste, and critical shortages. Some units reported receiving Sturmgewehrs but waiting weeks for ammunition, rendering the revolutionary weapons temporarily useless. The most damning evidence came from field adaptations observed on the Eastern Front. German units, desperate for automatic fire capability but unable to get sufficient Sturmgewehrs, began converting their bolt-action rifles to fire in semi-automatic mode through crude but effective modifications. Others salvaged Soviet pp 41 seconds from the battlefield, along with their ammunition, using the enemy's weapons against them. These improvisations spoke volumes about the fundamental failure to deliver the right weapon at the right time in the right quantities. The concept had been correct, the design brilliant, the manufacturing heroic under impossible circumstances, but the strategic timing had been fatally flawed. The Sturmgewehr 44 represented the future of infantry combat. Every major power would eventually adopt its basic concept: an intermediate cartridge, selective fire capability, detachable magazine. The Soviet AK-47, American M16, British L1A1, and virtually every modern military rifle would follow the conceptual path blazed by the Sturmgewehr. But this vindication would come too late for the Third Reich, whose armies were being systematically destroyed by the very forces the wonder weapon was designed to defeat. Krause leaned back in his chair, the weight of mathematical certainty settling on his shoulders. If we had started mass production in 1941 instead of 1943, if Hitler hadn't dismissed the concept, if we had prioritized it over other weapons programs. Vollmer shook his head slowly. Even then, we could never have matched Soviet production numbers. We might have made a difference on some sectors for some time, but the arithmetic would still favor them. One brilliant weapon cannot overcome millions of adequate ones. This was the tragic truth that both men now confronted. The Sturmgewehr 44 was the right weapon, developed at the right time, but deployed far too late and in quantities far too small to change the outcome of a war that had already been decided by industrial capacity rather than technical brilliance. As Allied bombs continued falling on Berlin above them, both men understood they were witnessing not just the defeat of Germany, but the birth of a new era in warfare, one their revolutionary weapon had helped create, but which Germany would not survive to see. The analytical assessment Krause and Vollmer prepared for the German High Command in December 1944 was clinical, mathematical, undeniable in its logic. It compared Sturmgewehr 44 production capacity to Soviet small arms output across every significant category: AC, manufacturing rates, deployment numbers, ammunition supply, and replacement ratios. Every comparison told the same story. Germany was outproduced in every category by significant margins, and the gap was widening rather than narrowing as the war continued. But the report went beyond simply presenting production numbers. The analysts included detailed projections of what these figures meant for military operations over the next 3 to 6 months. They calculated that Soviet production advantages meant Germany would face increasing numerical superiority on the Eastern Front, regardless of the Sturmgewehr's tactical advantages. German forces could continue winning individual engagements through superior weapons, better training, and sometimes better tactics, but they would inevitably lose the broader campaign through attrition. Every Sturmgewehr lost, damaged, or captured would take weeks to replace, if replaced at all. Soviet weapons lost were replaced within days. The mathematics of attrition warfare inexorably favored the side with industrial capacity to sustain losses indefinitely, and that side was not Germany. The report included projections for early 1945. If current production trends continued, by February 1945, Soviet forces would achieve small arms numerical superiority ratios of 15-1 or greater across all frontline sectors. By spring, ratios would likely reach 20-1 or higher, as German manufacturing continued to suffer under Allied bombing, while Soviet production increased. German infantry, no matter how well equipped with the new assault rifle, could not sustain combat against such numerical odds indefinitely. Quality advantages in individual weapon systems became irrelevant when facing 20 times as many enemy weapons. Even if German soldiers maintained their tactical superiority, even if they won every engagement, the cumulative losses would eventually destroy the Wehrmacht through simple attrition. Available manpower was finite, industrial capacity was constrained, territory was being lost rather than gained, reducing access to resources. The trajectory pointed inexorably toward defeat. The report concluded with mathematical certainty that the Sturmgewehr 44, despite its revolutionary design, had arrived too late and in quantities too limited to change the outcome of the war. This was not defeatism or political opinion. It was objective analysis based on verified data. The conclusion was professional assessment that should have informed strategic decision-making. The analysts expected the High Command to use this information to develop realistic options. Perhaps Germany could seek diplomatic solutions while still holding significant territory and maintaining some bargaining position. Perhaps resources could be reallocated to focus on defensive operations that might extend the war while seeking political settlement. Perhaps the information could inform decisions about which weapons programs to prioritize and which to abandon as the Reich's industrial capacity continued to decline. At minimum, realistic understanding of the situation might prevent wasteful offensives that consumed irreplaceable resources and weapons without achieving strategic objectives. Krause presented this report to his superiors in the High Command with full knowledge of its controversial implications. He was not a defeatist. His professional record demonstrated commitment to German victory. He was not a traitor. His military heritage and personal honor were beyond question. He was a professional weapons analyst presenting accurate data so that leadership could make informed decisions. He expected disagreement, perhaps anger at the unwelcome conclusions. What he encountered was something worse, complete rejection of the analysis itself. Hitler refused to accept the report's conclusions, calling them defeatist propaganda undermining German morale. He argued that German technological superiority, tactical excellence, and impending wonder weapons would overcome numerical disadvantages. He cited historical examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones through superior equipment and determination, SS, Frederick the Great's victories when outnumbered, Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, Rommel's early campaigns in North Africa. He insisted that Soviet production figures were exaggerated for propaganda purposes, that Soviet weapons were crude and would fail in combat, that Soviet soldiers lacked the intelligence to effectively use their weapons, that Germany's qualitative edge would prevail over Soviet quantity. Other commanders and Nazi leadership figures reacted similarly. They pointed to localized tactical successes where Sturmgewehr-equipped units had decimated much larger Soviet forces. They emphasized the weapon's technical superiority over anything in the Soviet arsenal. They argued that German soldiers were better trained, better led, more ideologically motivated than Soviet forces. They believed that tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantage. Some argued that other secret weapons under development, FTER, guided missiles, advanced jet aircraft, new tank designs, would change the strategic balance. Krause attempted to explain that tactics became irrelevant against overwhelming material superiority, that quality differences disappeared when facing 15 times as many enemies, that even the best-equipped troops could not fight effectively when surrounded on all sides. His arguments were dismissed as defeatism. The report was filed and ignored. The German High Command's rejection of these intelligence assessments represented a fundamental failure to understand how modern industrial warfare worked. Military traditions from previous centuries emphasized superior weapons, skill, leadership, tactical brilliance as the decisive factors in warfare. These qualities had won wars for thousands of years. Individual warriors with superior equipment could defeat larger numbers of inferior opponents. Superior weapons could overcome numerical disadvantages. Brilliant commanders could achieve victory through maneuver and deception. But World War II was different from all previous conflicts. It was the first truly industrial, total war where victory depended more on factory output than battlefield prowess. The nation that could produce more weapons, ammunition, and supplies would win through simple attrition, regardless of technical considerations. Germany's military leadership, trained in traditional Prussian military methods and Nazi ideological superiority, could not psychologically accept this new reality. But some German officers did understand. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops and one of Germany's greatest tactical commanders, wrote in a memorandum about studying captured Soviet equipment and supply documents. He concluded that Germany was fighting an enemy with vastly superior industrial resources and that victory was impossible under these circumstances, regardless of tactical advantages or superior weapons. Field Marshal Walter Model reached similar conclusions after fighting Soviet forces across multiple fronts. He noted in reports to the High Command that German technological superiority meant nothing against enemies who could replace losses immediately, while German units fought with steadily dwindling resources. By January 1945, he had become grimly realistic about Germany's chances, telling his staff officers that their duty now was to save as many German lives as possible while maintaining their honor, not to pursue illusory victory through wonder weapons. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood the production gap and worked frantically to increase German output. He achieved significant increases through rationalization of production, better resource allocation, and ruthless exploitation of slave labor. German weapons production increased substantially under his direction. 1944 saw peak German output in most categories, including the Sturmgewehr 44, which reached maximum monthly production of 31,800 units in December 1944. But Speer knew his efforts were insufficient. After a particularly honest briefing in Dut Faces, February 1945, where he presented Hitler with unvarnished production figures compared to estimated Soviet output, Hitler flew into a rage, accusing Speer of sabotage and defeatism. Speer would later state, "In that moment, I realized that rational decision-making had been completely abandoned. Faith in wonder weapons and willpower had replaced strategic reality. Yet he continued demanding production increases, making speeches about technological superiority and ultimate victory, because his position left no alternative." The weapons analysts continued their work throughout early 1945, even as their reports were systematically dismissed or ignored. They documented the Soviet offensive operations with the same mathematical precision they had applied to production statistics. The January 1945 Vistula Oder offensive involved approximately 2 million Soviet troops, 6,400 tanks and assault guns, 4,700 aircraft, and 32,000 artillery pieces against German forces totaling about 400,000 men, 1,150 tanks, 600 aircraft, and 4,100 artillery pieces. Even the most conservative calculations put Soviet superiority at 5, 1-inch manpower, 6, 1-inch tanks, 7, 8, 1-inch aircraft, and 7, 8, 1-inch artillery. These weren't just numbers on paper. The stark reality played out across the frozen battlefields of Poland and East Prussia. German forces fought skillfully, often inflicting disproportionate casualties on attacking Soviet units. Sturmgewehr-equipped troops particularly excelled in defensive positions, where their automatic fire could devastate dense Soviet infantry formations. But tactical success meant nothing when facing such overwhelming numbers. Soviet forces could absorb catastrophic losses and continue advancing. If one attack failed, they launched another. If one division was decimated, another took its place. The sheer volume of men and material overwhelmed even the most skilled defense. By February 1945, as Soviet forces pushed toward the Oder River just 70 kilometers from Berlin, the reality of production mathematics became impossible to ignore, even for the most ardent believers in final victory. The Red Army was deploying fresh divisions while German units were reduced to battle groups. Soviet tanks appeared in seemingly endless columns, while German armor reserves were measured in dozens. Soviet artillery fired massive preparatory bombardments, while German guns rationed shells. The arithmetic of defeat was written not just in production reports, but in the daily reality of the collapsing front. The deployment of the Sturmgewehr 44 provides a poignant case study in how technological superiority cannot overcome fundamental industrial disadvantage. The weapon itself was revolutionary. It created an entirely new category of infantry weapon that would dominate battlefields for the next century. Its intermediate cartridge solved the fundamental problem of infantry combat, air, the need for controllable automatic fire with sufficient range and stopping power. Its ergonomics, reliability, and effectiveness were confirmed not just by German field reports, but by the frantic efforts of the Allies to capture and study examples. The Soviet Union, in particular, recognized its significance immediately. When Soviet forces captured examples of the Sturmgewehr in 1944, they were rushed to weapons design bureaus in Moscow for intensive study. Mikhail Kalashnikov, working on his own assault rifle designs, incorporated numerous conceptual elements from the German weapon. The result would eventually become the AK-47, the most produced firearm in human history with over 100 million manufactured. The Americans similarly recognized the Sturmgewehr's importance, leading eventually to the development of the M16 rifle family. Even the British, traditionally conservative in small arms design, would eventually adopt the L-85 following the same basic concept. But this future influence meant nothing for the immediate German strategic situation. By the time significant numbers of Sturmgewehrs reached frontline units, Germany had already lost the war of production. The weapon that could have dramatically increased German infantry firepower in 1941 or 1942, potentially changing the course of critical battles like Stalingrad or Kursk, arrived when the Reich was already in strategic collapse. The timing was tragically ironic. The Sturmgewehr reached its peak monthly production rate of 31,800 units in December 1944, EP, precisely when the German capacity to effectively deploy and sustain these weapons was rapidly diminishing. Railroad networks were devastated by Allied bombing. Fuel shortages crippled transport. Training time for new recruits had been cut to weeks or even days, insufficient to master the new weapon. Ammunition shortages meant that even units equipped with Sturmgewehrs often couldn't fully exploit their capabilities. Some units received the new weapons but were limited to firing single shots to conserve ammunition, negating the key advantage of automatic fire. Others had plenty of ammunition but lacked spare parts to maintain the rifles in field conditions. One particularly telling field report from the 9th Panzer Division in February 1945 noted, "The Sturmgewehr is the finest infantry weapon we have ever fielded. With adequate ammunition, a single soldier can deliver the firepower of 5 men with Kar-9 8K rifles. However, we have 230 Sturmgewehrs, and only enough ammunition for 2 days of moderate combat. We face Soviet forces with thousands of pp-41 seconds and seemingly unlimited ammunition. The mathematical outcome is inevitable." Dr. Vollmer, the weapon's primary designer, conducted a final analysis in March 1945 that quantified the tragic reality. By his calculations, Germany had manufactured approximately 425,000 Sturmgewehrs since production began. Of these, approximately 322,000 had reached frontline units, the remainder lost to Allied bombing, transportation breakdowns, or still in transit when the territory was overrun. Soviet forces, during the same period, had produced over 6 million ppsh-41 submachine guns, SCAS, crude by comparison, but devastatingly effective in the close-quarters combat that characterized the Eastern Front's final battles. The production ratio of roughly 14, 1 inch the Soviets' favor represented a military reality that no tactical brilliance or technological superiority could overcome. The human dimension of this production disparity was equally stark. By early 1945, Germany was scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel, drafting teenagers and old men into Volkssturm units that received minimal training and often inferior weapons. Even elite formations were shadows of their former strength, filled with hastily trained replacements. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic casualties in the war's early years, still fielded armies of young, increasingly well-trained soldiers. The manpower equation mirrored the production disparity. Germany could not replace losses, while Soviet forces seemed to have inexhaustible reserves of men. Colonel Krause did not live to see Germany's final defeat. He was killed during an Allied air raid on Berlin in March 1945 while working at the Heereswaffenamt headquarters. His death removed one of Germany's most clear-eyed weapons analysts, a man who had tried repeatedly to provide objective assessment of production realities to inform strategic decisions. Dr. Vollmer survived the war. In the final weeks, he organized the preservation of technical documents relating to the Sturmgewehr, hiding them in a salt mine in the Bavarian Alps. After German surrender, he made contact with American forces and offered his expertise. The Americans, recognizing the value of his knowledge, eventually employed him as a consultant on small arms design. He would later contribute to post-war German and NATO weapons development, his expertise helping shape a new generation of infantry weapons. The Sturmgewehr files he preserved became valuable technical resources for Western arms designers, the weapon's influence extending far beyond its limited wartime deployment. The story of the Sturmgewehr 44 reveals profound truths about modern warfare that remain relevant decades later. Industrial capacity determines victory in total war between modern nations. Courage, skill, tactical brilliance, technological superiority, SEC, all these matter, but they cannot overcome overwhelming material disadvantage. The Germans discovered this truth through careful analysis of production statistics, field reports, and rigorous mathematical calculation. They presented this truth to their leadership repeatedly throughout 1944 and early 1945. Their warnings were ignored because accepting them meant accepting inevitable defeat. The tragedy was not just that Germany lost. The tragedy was that the loss was predictable, documented, and presented to leadership who refused to accept mathematical reality. The German weapons analysts who studied Soviet production capabilities and field deployment statistics performed their professional duties with competence and integrity. They gathered information from multiple independent sources. They analyzed data carefully and systematically. They presented conclusions based on evidence rather than ideology or wishful thinking. Their work represented what intelligence services should do: provide accurate assessments to enable informed decision-making. That their conclusions were systematically ignored and rejected represents failure not of intelligence, but of leadership, unwilling to accept unpleasant truths. The mathematical proof of German defeat existed in production reports showing Soviet factories producing submachine guns by the millions, while German plants struggled to deliver thousands of Sturmgewehrs. It existed in deployment statistics, showing Soviet divisions receiving new weapons in quantities that German units could only dream of. It existed in ammunition figures, showing Soviet troops firing more rounds in a day than German units received in a week. It existed in manpower reports, showing Soviet armies growing stronger while German formations withered away. The proof was comprehensive, verified from multiple sources, mathematically undeniable, and systematically ignored by those with power to act on it. Looking back from the perspective of decades, the weapons assessments of late 1944 and early 1945 appear both prescient and tragically futile. The analysts were correct in every major conclusion. The Sturmgewehr 44 was revolutionary but had arrived too late and in quantities too limited to change the outcome. The mathematics of attrition made defeat inevitable. No amount of technological superiority could overcome such fundamental material disadvantage. But this knowledge changed nothing because leadership chose to believe in willpower, ideology, and wonder weapons rather than arithmetic. The war continued until Germany's complete military collapse, until cities were ruins, until millions more were dead, until the evidence of defeat was written not in production reports, but in Soviet tanks on the streets of Berlin. The lesson from this historical episode transcends World War II and remains relevant for understanding military technology. Revolutionary weapons mean nothing without the industrial capacity to produce them in sufficient quantities at the right time. Accurate intelligence is worthless if leadership refuses to accept unwelcome conclusions. Systematic analysis means nothing if decisions are based on ideology rather than evidence. Professional competence becomes irrelevant when confronted with willful blindness. German weapons designers provided brilliant innovation that was decades ahead of its time. German leadership chose fantasy over reality, and the result was catastrophe. Wars between industrial powers are fundamentally economic contests won in factories, before outcomes are decided on battlefields. This principle was proven definitively in World War II. Germany's weapons analysts understood this by late 1944. They documented it meticulously. They presented it clearly. They warned repeatedly that the Sturmgewehr 44, despite its revolutionary design, had arrived too late to change the outcome of a war already decided by production capacity. Their leadership never accepted this truth. The cost of that refusal was measured in millions of lives, destroyed cities, and Germany's total destruction as a nation-state. In May 1945, as Soviet forces raised their flag over the Reichstag, the Sturmgewehr 44 represented evidence of a simple but decisive reality. Technological brilliance without industrial capacity to support it is ultimately futile. This advantage was not marginal. It was overwhelming, sufficient to make German defeat inevitable regardless of tactical performance. The 5-to-1 advantages in production can be overcome through superior weapons, better training, advantageous terrain. 15-to-1 advantages cannot be overcome except through enemy mistakes so massive as to be unlikely. The Soviet advantage exceeded 1 inch many categories by 1945 and was growing larger over time. In the end, German weapon designers studied Soviet production statistics and understood they could never win, not through any single revelation, but through accumulation of undeniable evidence over months. Each captured document added data points. Each field report confirmed patterns. Each factory assessment provided validation. The picture that emerged was complete, verified, mathematically certain. Germany faced enemies with production capacity many times greater than its own, and that gap was widening. No amount of technological brilliance or fighting spirit could overcome such fundamental disparity in an industrial war. The analysts knew this, documented it meticulously, and presented it clearly to leadership. Their tragedy was not analytical failure, but the irrelevance of accurate analysis when leadership refuses to accept reality. The Sturmgewehr 44 told a story of inevitable defeat written in numbers that could not be argued with or dismissed except through willful blindness. It showed technological brilliance that seemed impossible according to conventional thinking, but was verified through battlefield performance. It revealed an enemy so overwhelmed by Soviet numerical superiority that German hopes of victory through technological superiority were fantasies disconnected from material reality. The only question remaining by early 1945 was how long Germany would deny what the numbers made clear. How many more would die before arithmetic replaced ideology as the basis for strategic decisions? That question was answered on the 8th of May 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, defeated not primarily by superior Soviet tactics, but by the mathematical certainty that industrial capacity determines victory in modern war. The weapons analysts who first studied production statistics in late 1944 had understood this truth months earlier. They had tried to warn their leadership. They had presented the evidence. They had shown the mathematics. Their warnings were ignored, and millions paid the price for that willful blindness. The story of the Sturmgewehr 44 documents not just a revolutionary weapon, but the futility of technological superiority without the industrial capacity to produce it in sufficient quantities at the right time. The numbers told a truth that German leadership could not accept. In modern industrial warfare, factories matter more than individual weapon quality. Production lines determine outcomes more than tactical brilliance, and arithmetic always wins in the end. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.